Welcome to History Teller YT. History is not just about dates and maps. History is about power, silence, and the lives that were never asked before decisions were made. In today's story, we travel back to the late 19th century to a moment when a handful of European men sat around a table in Berlin and decided the fate of an entire continent they barely knew. No Africans were invited. No African voices were heard. Yet lines were drawn, borders were created, and millions of lives were changed forever. This is the story of the Scramble for Africa. A story of kingdoms that existed long before Europe arrived. A story of greed disguised as civilization. A story of railroads built not for people, but for profit. A story of resistance, suffering, and survival. From the Berlin Conference of 1884 to forced labor, stolen land, broken societies, and artificial borders that still shape the world today. This history explains why Africa looks the way it does in the modern world. This is not a story told from the conqueror's chair. This is history told with truth, context, and humanity. If you want to understand colonialism beyond textbooks, if you want to know how the past still controls the present, then stay with History Teller YT. Because this is not just African history. This is world history. Before the late 19th century, Africa was not an empty, chaotic, or uncivilized land waiting to be claimed, as European propaganda would later suggest. It was a vast and diverse continent made up of thousands of societies, kingdoms, empires, and communities, each with its own political systems, economic networks, cultures, and worldviews. From the Mediterranean coast to the Cape of Good Hope, African societies had governed themselves for centuries, often with highly sophisticated institutions that Europeans either ignored or deliberately misunderstood. The idea that Africa lacked history before European intervention was a myth constructed to justify imperial conquest. Across West Africa, powerful states such as the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Dahomey, and the Sokoto Caliphate exercised centralized authority, maintained standing armies, collected taxes, and conducted diplomacy with foreign powers. The Mali and Songhai empires, earlier examples of African greatness, had controlled trans-Saharan trade routes, linking Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe long before modern colonialism. Cities like Timbuktu were renowned centers of learning, housing libraries and universities that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. These facts directly contradicted European claims that Africa lacked intellectual or political development. In East Africa, Swahili city-states such as Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar thrived through Indian Ocean trade, connecting Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. These cities demonstrated advanced urban planning, architecture, and commercial law. Meanwhile, in Central and Southern Africa, kingdoms such as Congo, Luba, Lunda, and Great Zimbabwe showed complex governance structures and economic systems based on agriculture, mining, and regional trade. Many African societies practiced systems of accountability, councils of elders, and customary law that ensured social stability and continuity. African sovereignty was not theoretical. It was real and enforced. Borders were understood through cultural, linguistic, and political realities rather than straight lines on maps. Conflict existed, as it does in all human societies, but it was governed by rules, diplomacy, and negotiation. When Europeans later claimed Africa was disorganized, they were projecting their own ignorance and racial bias rather than describing reality. Understanding Africa before the Scramble is essential because it exposes colonialism not as a civilizing mission, but as an act of deliberate disruption against functioning societies. European interaction with Africa did not begin with the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. It evolved gradually over several centuries, shaped by shifting economic and political motivations. Initially, European powers such as Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, Britain, and France approached Africa primarily as a trading partner rather than a territory to conquer. From the 15th century onward, Europeans established coastal forts and trading posts, especially along West Africa, focusing on gold, ivory, spices, and eventually human beings through the transatlantic slave trade. The slave trade marked a turning point in Europe's relationship with Africa. Over several centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes, transported across the Atlantic under horrific conditions, and enslaved in the Americas. This system devastated African populations, destabilized societies, and fueled violence as European demand for enslaved labor encouraged warfare and raids. While some African rulers participated in the trade, it was driven and expanded by European economic interests, and its long-term consequences weakened many regions, making them more vulnerable to later colonial conquest. By the early 19th century, the global context began to change. The abolition of the slave trade by Britain and other European powers did not signal a moral awakening so much as a shift in economic priorities. The Industrial Revolution transformed European economies, increasing the demand for raw materials such as rubber, cotton, palm oil, copper, and minerals. Africa was now seen not just as a source of labor, but as a vast reservoir of natural resources and a potential market for manufactured goods. Trade alone was no longer enough. Control became the new objective. Missionaries, explorers, and traders played a critical role in preparing the ground for imperial expansion. Figures like David Livingstone presented Africa as a continent in need of Christianity, commerce, and civilization, reinforcing narratives that justified intervention. Maps produced by European explorers often erased existing African political realities, portraying territories as blank spaces open for claim. This combination of economic ambition, religious ideology, and racial superiority laid the foundation for a more aggressive phase of European involvement, transforming informal influence into formal domination. The scramble for Africa cannot be understood without examining the broader global forces driving European behavior in the late 19th century. Industrialization fundamentally altered the balance of power within Europe and intensified competition between nations. Factories required raw materials, workers needed jobs, and industrialists sought new markets to sell their products. Africa appeared to offer solutions to all three problems. As a result, imperial expansion became closely tied to economic survival and national prosperity in the European imagination. At the same time, nationalism was reshaping European politics. Newly unified states like Germany and Italy sought overseas empires to assert their status alongside older powers such as Britain and France. Colonies became symbols of national pride and strength. Political leaders argued that failing to acquire colonies meant falling behind rival nations. This mindset turned imperialism into a competitive race, where speed and aggression mattered more than diplomacy or ethical considerations. Africa, largely unprotected by European-style military technology, became the primary arena for this rivalry. Technological advances gave Europeans a decisive advantage. Steamships allowed deeper penetration into African rivers, while railways enabled the movement of troops and resources. The invention of the Maxim gun made African resistance far more difficult, shifting the balance of power dramatically. Medical developments, such as the use of quinine to combat malaria, reduced European mortality in tropical regions, removing one of the major barriers to long-term occupation. These innovations made conquest not only possible, but profitable. Crucially, European powers feared that unregulated competition in Africa could lead to war among themselves. Diplomatic tensions were rising, and Africa became both a cause of conflict and a proposed solution. This fear would soon lead to the Berlin Conference, where European leaders sought to impose order on their rivalry by formally dividing the continent among themselves. Notably, no African representatives were invited. Decisions about Africa's future were made entirely without African consent, setting the stage for one of the most violent and transformative periods in global history. By the early 1880s, European involvement in Africa had reached a critical point. What had once been limited to coastal trading posts and informal influence was rapidly turning into aggressive territorial expansion. European powers were racing to secure land, resources, and strategic advantages, often without clear rules or agreements. This unregulated competition created growing anxiety among European leaders, who feared that colonial disputes in Africa could escalate into full-scale wars in Europe itself. The continent was becoming a powder keg, and Africa was the fuse. One of the most immediate triggers for international concern was the aggressive behavior of King Leopold II of Belgium. Unlike other imperial ventures, Leopold's ambitions in Central Africa were presented as humanitarian and scientific efforts rather than outright colonization. Through organizations such as the International African Association, Leopold claimed to promote exploration, anti-slavery efforts, and development. In reality, he was secretly establishing personal control over vast territories in the Congo Basin. When rival powers realized the scale of Leopold's ambitions, alarm spread quickly across Europe. France and Britain were already expanding their influence in West and North Africa, while Portugal attempted to revive old claims linking Angola and Mozambique. Meanwhile, the newly unified German Empire, under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, sought colonies to assert its status as a global power. Germany's sudden interest in Africa added urgency to the situation. Bismarck himself was initially skeptical of colonialism, but he recognized that hosting an international conference could position Germany as a diplomatic leader while protecting its growing interests. The Berlin Conference was therefore not born out of concern for Africa or Africans, but out of European self-interest. Its primary purpose was to regulate imperial competition, prevent conflict between European powers, and establish rules for claiming territory. Africa was treated as an object to be managed rather than a living continent inhabited by millions of people. This mindset would define the tone and outcomes of the conference, shaping the future of Africa for generations. The Berlin Conference was held from November 1884 to February 1885 in Berlin, Germany. Representatives from 14 countries attended, including Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and the United States. Notably absent were any African leaders, diplomats, or representatives. The continent whose fate was being decided had no voice at the table. This exclusion was not accidental. It reflected deeply entrenched racist assumptions that Africans were incapable of governing themselves or participating in international diplomacy. One of the most significant outcomes of the conference was the principle of effective occupation. Under this rule, European powers could no longer simply claim territory on maps or based on historical presence. Instead, they were required to demonstrate actual control through administration, military presence, and economic activity. While this principle was intended to reduce conflict between European nations, its real effect was to accelerate the invasion and occupation of African lands. European powers rushed inland to establish control before their rivals could do so. The conference also guaranteed free navigation on major African rivers such as the Congo and Niger, ensuring that trade routes remained open to all European nations. On the surface, this appeared to promote economic cooperation, but in practice it reinforced European dominance over African commerce. African control over trade networks was ignored, and local economies were increasingly subordinated to European interests. The decisions made in Berlin prioritized European access and profit over African sovereignty and well-being. Perhaps the most infamous outcome was the formal recognition of King Leopold II's control over the Congo Free State. Despite vague humanitarian language, Leopold was granted personal ownership of a territory larger than Western Europe. No mechanisms were established to protect the rights or lives of the Congolese people. This decision would later result in one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history. The Berlin Conference thus set a dangerous precedent. Legality and legitimacy were defined by European agreement, not by justice or consent. One of the most enduring legacies of the Berlin Conference was the arbitrary division of African territory. European diplomats relied heavily on maps, many of which were incomplete or inaccurate. Borders were drawn using straight lines, rivers, and latitude markers, often with little or no knowledge of the peoples living in those regions. Ethnic groups, kingdoms, and communities were split apart, while rival groups were forced into single colonial units. These artificial borders ignored centuries of political, cultural, and social organization. The consequences of this border-making process were immediate and severe. Traditional systems of governance were undermined as colonial administrations imposed foreign laws, languages, and authorities. African leaders who had ruled legitimately were stripped of power or turned into colonial intermediaries. Resistance was often met with violence, as European forces sought to enforce control over territories that existed only on paper. The notion of effective occupation translated into military conquest and suppression. Long after the end of colonial rule, these borders would continue to shape African politics. Many post-independence conflicts can be traced directly to the divisions created in Berlin. Civil wars, ethnic tensions, and territorial disputes were often the result of incompatible groups being forced together or historically unified peoples being separated by colonial boundaries. While African societies have shown remarkable resilience, the structural damage caused by these divisions has proven difficult to overcome. The Berlin Conference represents a turning point in global history. It transformed imperial ambition into a coordinated system of domination and legalized the theft of African land on an unprecedented scale. By reducing Africa to lines on a map, European powers erased human realities and set in motion a colonial system whose consequences are still felt today. Understanding this process is essential for grasping the depth of colonialism's brutal legacy. After the Berlin Conference, European powers wasted no time turning diplomatic agreements into physical control. What had been discussed in elegant rooms in Berlin now translated into armed expeditions, military campaigns, and forced treaties across the African continent. The principle of effective occupation encouraged speed and aggression. European nations believed that delay meant loss, so they rushed to plant flags, establish forts, and claim authority over territories they barely understood. This marked the true beginning of the violent phase of the scramble for Africa. European officers, backed by their governments and private companies, pushed inland from the coasts along rivers and newly carved routes. Treaties were often imposed on African leaders through deception, coercion, or outright force. Many African rulers believed they were signing agreements of trade, or protection, only to later discover they had unknowingly surrendered sovereignty. Language barriers, legal manipulation, and deliberate mistranslation played a central role in this process, making so-called treaties tools of dispossession rather than diplomacy. Military technology ensured European dominance in most confrontations. African armies, though brave and often well-organized, were largely equipped with outdated weapons. The Maxim gun, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, became a symbol of imperial brutality. Battles that might once have been evenly matched turned into massacres. European forces justified these actions by portraying African resistance as savagery, ignoring the reality that Africans were defending their lands, communities, and independence. Private companies also played a major role in conquest. Chartered companies, such as the British South Africa Company and the Royal Niger Company, were granted authority to administer territories, collect taxes, and maintain armed forces. These corporations blurred the line between state power and private profit, often ruling with extreme violence. Their primary goal was extraction, not governance. As a result, the early colonial period was marked by chaos, exploitation, and widespread suffering for African populations. Despite overwhelming odds, African societies did not passively accept European domination. Resistance took many forms, ranging from armed conflict and guerrilla warfare to diplomacy, migration, and cultural preservation. African leaders recognized the threat posed by European expansion and responded with determination and creativity. These resistance movements challenged the false narrative that Africa was easily conquered or lacked the will to fight back. In West Africa, leaders such as Samori Touré organized large, disciplined armies to resist French expansion. Samori adapted his tactics, acquired firearms through trade, and used strategic retreats to prolong resistance for years. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom, under leaders like Setshwayo, famously defeated British forces at the Battle of Isanona in 1879, demonstrating that European armies were not invincible. Although the Zulu were eventually defeated, their resistance became a powerful symbol of African military capability. In East Africa, the Maji-Maji rebellion against German rule united diverse ethnic groups in a shared struggle. Though ultimately crushed with devastating loss of life, the rebellion revealed deep opposition to colonial exploitation and forced labor. Spiritual beliefs, including faith and protective rituals, played a significant role in mobilizing resistance, highlighting the cultural dimensions of anti-colonial struggle. These movements were not irrational. They reflected coherent worldviews and political goals rooted in local traditions. Resistance also occurred through nonviolent means. Some communities withdrew into difficult terrain to avoid colonial control, while others preserved language, religion, and customs as acts of defiance. African women played crucial roles as organizers, messengers, and leaders, though their contributions were often erased from colonial records. While European conquest eventually succeeded militarily, African resistance delayed expansion, increased its cost, and left a legacy of courage that would inspire later independence movements. As resistance intensified, European colonial regimes responded with extreme violence designed to break African opposition and instill fear. Collective punishment became standard practice. Entire villages were burned, crops destroyed, and civilians targeted in retaliation for resistance. These tactics were not accidental excesses. They were central to the logic of colonial rule. European authorities believed that terror was an effective tool for establishing control over vast territories with limited manpower. Forced labor systems were imposed across many colonies to build roads, railways, and plantations. Africans were compelled to work under brutal conditions, often for little or no pay. Refusal was met with imprisonment, flogging, or death. Colonial administrations justified forced labor as necessary for development, but in reality, it served European economic interests while devastating African societies. Families were separated, agricultural cycles disrupted, and traditional livelihoods destroyed. Legal systems were redesigned to favor colonial authority. Africans were subjected to separate laws, denied basic rights, and punished under arbitrary regulations. Colonial courts rarely recognized African testimony or customary law. This institutionalized inequality reinforced racial hierarchies and normalized violence. The idea that Africans were inherently inferior was embedded in policy, education, and administration, shaping colonial governance at every level. The early years of the Scramble established patterns that would persist throughout the colonial period. Violence was not an exception, but a foundation. Order was maintained through fear, and obedience was extracted through force. These methods left deep psychological and social scars that extended beyond the colonial era. Understanding this phase is essential for recognizing colonialism not as a benign administrative system, but as a regime built on coercion, suffering, and systematic dehumanization. Once military conquest had secured territorial control, European powers faced the challenge of governing vast African lands with relatively small numbers of officials. Colonial administration was therefore designed not to serve African populations, but to extract resources efficiently while maintaining order at minimal cost. To achieve this, Europeans systematically dismantled existing African political systems and replaced them with structures that prioritized obedience to colonial authority. This process fundamentally altered how power operated across the continent. In many regions, colonial rulers removed kings, chiefs, and councils that had previously governed with legitimacy. Some African leaders were executed, imprisoned, or exiled for resisting colonial rule. Others were retained but transformed into colonial intermediaries, often referred to as chiefs, regardless of their traditional roles. These individuals were expected to enforce colonial policies, collect taxes, and supply labor. Their authority no longer came from their people, but from European administrators, undermining traditional accountability and social trust. Different European powers adopted different administrative models, though all were rooted in domination. Britain favored indirect rule, governing through selected local leaders while maintaining ultimate authority. This system allowed Britain to rule large territories cheaply, but often empowered individuals who lacked traditional legitimacy, creating internal divisions. France pursued a policy of direct rule and assimilation, attempting to impose French language, culture, and legal systems while weakening African institutions. Both approaches disrupted African governance and reshaped societies to serve colonial interests. Colonial capitals, administrative districts, and bureaucracies were imposed without regard for existing political or cultural boundaries. European law replaced customary systems, often criminalizing traditional practices. Africans were excluded from meaningful participation in governance, reinforcing racial hierarchies. Administration was not neutral. It was a tool of control. By redefining authority, colonial systems ensured that power flowed outward to Europe rather than inward toward African communities. At the heart of colonial rule was economic exploitation. European powers viewed African colonies primarily as sources of raw materials and cheap labor. Colonial economies were structured to serve metropolitan needs rather than local development. This transformation was deliberate and systematic. reshaping African land use, labor patterns, and trade relationships in ways that prioritize European profit over African well-being. Cash crop agriculture was aggressively promoted across the continent. Africans were forced or pressured to grow crops such as cocoa, cotton, coffee, rubber, and peanuts for export. Traditional subsistence farming was discouraged or disrupted, making communities dependent on volatile global markets. In many regions, land was seized and declared colonial property, pushing Africans onto reserves or forcing them to work on European-owned plantations. This loss of land undermined food security and social stability. Mining became another pillar of colonial exploitation. Gold, diamonds, copper, and other minerals were extracted under harsh conditions. African workers labored long hours for low wages, often in dangerous environments. Colonial governments imposed taxes payable only in cash, compelling Africans to enter wage labor to survive. These taxes were not meant to fund local services. They were tools to force participation in the colonial economy. Infrastructure development, often cited as a benefit of colonialism, was designed primarily to facilitate extraction. Railways and ports connected mines and plantations to coastal export points, not African communities to one another. Very little investment was made in education, healthcare, or industry for Africans. Economic policy ensured dependency, preventing the growth of diversified local economies. Colonialism thus integrated Africa into the global economy on deeply unequal terms, with consequences that persist today. Colonial rule was not limited to political and economic domination. It also involved reshaping African societies at a social and psychological level. European authorities imposed rigid racial hierarchies that defined every aspect of colonial life. Whites occupied positions of power and privilege, while Africans were systematically marginalized. These hierarchies were reinforced through law, education, religion, and daily practice, embedding inequality into the fabric of society. Education systems were designed to produce a small class of Africans trained for subordinate roles. Mission schools emphasized obedience, discipline, and European values, often portraying African cultures as backward or sinful. History was rewritten to center Europe, erasing African achievements and promoting the idea that progress came only through colonial guidance. This intellectual domination aimed to legitimize foreign rule and weaken African confidence in their own identities. Religion was another powerful tool. Christian missionaries often worked alongside colonial administrations, whether intentionally or not. While some missionaries opposed extreme abuses, many reinforced colonial authority by promoting submission and acceptance of Europe. Conversion sometimes offered limited social mobility, further dividing communities. Colonial categorization also hardened ethnic identities. Groups that had previously interacted fluidly were labeled, ranked, and sometimes favored over others. These divisions were exploited to maintain control, following a strategy of divide and rule. Over time, colonial social engineering created tensions that outlasted colonialism itself. By reshaping how Africans saw themselves and one another, colonial regimes extended their influence beyond physical occupation, leaving deep and lasting scars. Among all colonial projects born from the Scramble for Africa, none became as infamous as the Congo Free State. Unlike other colonies, which were controlled by European governments, the Congo Free State was the personal property of one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. Through careful diplomacy, deception, and manipulation of humanitarian language, Leopold secured international recognition of his control over a vast region in Central Africa following the Berlin Conference. Publicly, he presented himself as a philanthropist dedicated to ending the Arab slave trade and bringing civilization to Africa. Privately, he was constructing one of the most exploitative regimes in modern history. Leopold never set foot in the Congo, yet he ruled it with absolute authority. Administration was carried out through a network of European officers, mercenaries, and private agents whose primary mission was profit extraction. The Congo's immense natural wealth, particularly ivory and later rubber, became the foundation of Leopold's fortune. There was no meaningful oversight, no accountability, and no concern for the welfare of the Congolese population. The state existed solely to enrich its owner. To enforce control, Leopold created the Force Publique, a colonial army composed of African soldiers commanded by European officers. This force was notorious for its brutality. Soldiers were ordered to meet production quotas, and failure was punished severely. Violence was not a response to disorder. It was a method of governance. Leopold's system transformed entire regions into labor camps, where survival depended on obedience and output. The creation of the Congo Free State exposed the dark truth behind the rhetoric of the Scramble. Beneath claims of civilization and progress lay unchecked greed. Leopold's colony demonstrated how international agreements like those made in Berlin could legitimize extreme violence when morality was subordinated to imperial ambition. The discovery of rubber's commercial value in the late 19th century intensified the horrors of the Congo Free State. As global demand for rubber soared, Leopold's administration imposed strict collection quotas on Congolese communities. Villages were required to deliver fixed amounts of rubber, often harvested from wild vines deep in forests. Meeting these quotas was physically exhausting and frequently impossible, yet failure was met with ruthless punishment. The Force Publique enforced rubber collection through terror. Hostages, often women and children, were taken to ensure compliance. Men who failed to meet quotas were beaten, mutilated, or executed. One of the most infamous practices was the severing of hands, used as proof that bullets had not been wasted. This grotesque system turned human bodies into accounting tools, reducing life to a measure of productivity. The social consequences were catastrophic. Entire communities were displaced as people fled forced labor zones. Agriculture collapsed as men were taken from fields for rubber collection, leading to famine and disease. Traditional leadership structures disintegrated under pressure, and family life was shattered. Population decline was massive. Historians estimate that millions of Congolese died due to violence, starvation, exhaustion, and disease during Leopold's rule. This was not chaos or mismanagement. It was systematic exploitation. The logic of the Congo Free State prioritized profit above all else. Human suffering was not an unintended side effect, but an accepted cost. The Congo became a symbol of colonialism's capacity for extreme cruelty when power operated without restraint or accountability. Despite Leopold's efforts to conceal the truth, reports of atrocities in the Congo eventually reached Europe and the wider world. Missionaries, travelers, and former colonial officials documented widespread abuse and violence. Photographs of mutilated Congolese victims shocked international audiences, challenging the image of benevolent imperialism. Activists such as Edie Morel and Roger Casement played crucial roles in exposing the reality of Leopold's regime through reports, publications, and political pressure. The Congo Reform Association became one of the first major international human rights campaigns. Public outrage grew as evidence mounted, forcing governments to confront the consequences of the system they had legitimized. Under intense pressure, the Belgian state intervened, and in 1908, Leopold was compelled to transfer control of the Congo Free State to Belgium. The territory became the Belgian Congo, ending Leopold's personal rule. However, the transfer did not erase the damage already done. While some reforms reduced the most extreme abuses, the colonial system of exploitation remained intact. Forced labor continued in different forms, and African voices were still excluded from governance. The reform process revealed the limits of colonial accountability. Action was taken not because African lives mattered equally, but because European reputations were at stake. The Congo Free State stands as one of the clearest examples of colonialism's brutal legacy. It exposes how international law, economic greed, and racial ideology combine to produce mass suffering. Remembering this history is essential, not only to honor its victims, but to understand the true nature of the scramble for Africa. One of the most defining features of colonial rule in Africa was the widespread use of forced labor. European powers justified this practice by claiming that Africans needed discipline, instruction, and guidance to become productive members of a modern economy. In reality, forced labor was a deliberate strategy to extract maximum economic value while minimizing costs. Colonial administrations lacked sufficient funds and personnel, so coercion became the primary method for building infrastructure and sustaining colonial economies. Across the continent, Africans were compelled to work on roads, railways, ports, plantations, and mines. Recruitment was rarely voluntary. Colonial officials used violence, imprisonment, and threats to force men into labor gangs for months or even years at a time. In some regions, entire villages were required to provide a fixed number of workers. Refusal often resulted in collective punishment, including fines, beatings, or the destruction of homes and crops. The conditions under which Africans labored were harsh and frequently deadly. Workers received little food, inadequate shelter, and minimal medical care. Exhaustion, accidents, and disease were common. Colonial authorities often dismissed high death rates as unavoidable or blamed African workers themselves, reinforcing racist assumptions about African bodies and resilience. The human cost of these labor systems was immense, yet largely ignored by colonial records. Forced labor disrupted African societies at every level. Families were separated for long periods, agricultural production declined, and social structures weakened. Time, which had once been organized around seasonal cycles and community needs, was reorganized to serve colonial demands. By controlling African labor, colonial regimes asserted control over African lives, transforming people into tools of empire rather than citizens with rights. Taxation was another powerful instrument of colonial control. European administrations introduced taxes not primarily to fund public services, but to force Africans into the colonial economy. Taxes were often payable only in cash, even in regions where money had not previously been widely used. This policy was intentional. By requiring cash payments, colonial governments compelled Africans to seek wage labor on plantations, in mines, or on colonial projects. Common forms of taxation included hut taxes, poll taxes, and land taxes. These taxes were imposed arbitrarily and without African consent. Failure to pay could result in imprisonment, seizure of property, or forced labor. Tax collectors were frequently accompanied by armed guards, turning taxation into an act of intimidation rather than civic responsibility. In many areas, taxes were deeply resented and became a major cause of resistance and unrest. Taxation reshaped African economies. Subsistence farming alone was no longer sufficient for survival, as families needed cash to meet colonial demands. This pushed Africans into exploitative labor arrangements and increased dependence on European employers. At the same time, colonial authorities invested little of the tax revenue back into African communities. Schools, hospitals, and public services were scarce and often reserved for Europeans. By monetizing survival, taxation undermined traditional economic systems and reinforced inequality. It tied African livelihoods to global markets they did not control and exposed them to economic shocks beyond their influence. Taxation was not neutral governance. It was economic coercion designed to ensure a steady supply of labor and resources for colonial enterprises. For most Africans, colonialism was experienced not through high-level policies, but through daily encounters with authority. Police officers, tax collectors, labor recruiters, and local chiefs acting on behalf of colonial governments shaped everyday life. These interactions were often marked by fear, humiliation, and powerlessness. Colonial rule was constantly reinforced through visible symbols of dominance, including uniforms, flags, courts, and prisons. Movement was frequently restricted. Pass systems and travel permits control where Africans could live and work. In settler colonies, racial segregation dictated access to land, housing, and public spaces. Africans were excluded from many urban areas or confined to overcrowded neighborhoods with poor sanitation. These policies reinforced racial hierarchies and limited opportunities for social mobility. Colonial justice systems further entrenched inequality. Africans were subject to separate laws and courts, where punishments were harsher and rights limited. Corporal punishment was widely used and legally sanctioned. Appeals were rare, and European officials held immense discretionary power. Justice was not about fairness. It was about maintaining order and obedience. Despite these pressures, Africans adapted and resisted in subtle ways. They formed new communities, maintained cultural practices, and supported one another through informal networks. Songs, stories, and rituals preserved collective memory and identity. Everyday life under colonialism was a constant negotiation between survival and resistance, revealing the resilience of African societies even under oppressive conditions. European colonialism in Africa was sustained not only by guns and armies, but by powerful ideas that justified domination. One of the most influential of these ideas was the so-called civilizing mission. European leaders, intellectuals, missionaries, and newspapers repeatedly claimed that colonial rule was a moral duty to uplift African societies. They portrayed Africa as backward, primitive, and stagnant, arguing that European intervention would bring progress, order, and enlightenment. This narrative was carefully constructed to mask exploitation behind a language of benevolence. The civilizing mission framed colonialism as a gift rather than an act of theft. Railways, schools, Christianity, and Western law were presented as evidence of Europe's generosity. What this narrative ignored was the fact that these developments primarily served colonial interests. Railways existed to transport raw materials. Schools trained Africans for subordinate roles, and laws protected European authority. Progress was defined narrowly according to European standards, leaving no room for African knowledge systems or values. This ideology also erased African agency. Africans were depicted as passive recipients of civilization rather than active participants in history. Resistance to colonial rule was dismissed as irrational violence or ignorance, never as a legitimate defense of sovereignty. By denying Africans political maturity, Europeans justified excluding them from decision-making and governance. The civilizing mission thus functioned as a moral shield, allowing extreme violence to be reframed as necessary discipline. Over time, this narrative became deeply embedded in colonial education and administration. Even critics of colonial abuses often accepted the underlying assumption that European rule was ultimately beneficial. This made meaningful reform difficult, as the fundamental injustice of colonial domination went unquestioned. Understanding the civilizing mission is essential because it reveals how ideas can normalize oppression and transform exploitation into a perceived moral obligation. Alongside the civilizing mission, colonial ideology was reinforced by scientific racism. In the 19th century, European scholars increasingly used distorted interpretations of biology, anthropology, and evolution to classify human populations into hierarchical races. Europeans placed themselves at the top of this hierarchy, portraying Africans as biologically inferior, intellectually limited, and closer to nature than civilization. These claims had no scientific basis, but they carried enormous political power. Scientific racism provided colonialism with a sense of inevitability. If Africans were inherently inferior, then European rule appeared not only justified but necessary. Colonial policies were shaped by these beliefs. Africans were excluded from skilled jobs, higher education, and political participation because they were deemed incapable. Harsh punishment, forced labor, and authoritarian rule were rationalized as appropriate for supposedly childlike or savage populations. These racial theories also influenced how Europeans recorded African history. African achievements were minimized or attributed to external influences, while failures were emphasized as evidence of racial deficiency. Museums displayed African artifacts as curiosities rather than products of complex societies. Anthropology often treated living African communities as objects of study rather than human beings with rights and voices. The impact of scientific racism extended far beyond the colonial period. It shaped global perceptions of Africa and Africans, influencing immigration policies, international relations, and cultural representation. Even after colonial rule ended, many of these stereotypes persisted, affecting how African nations were treated on the world stage. By exposing scientific racism as an ideological tool rather than a legitimate science, we can better understand how deeply colonial thinking distorted both knowledge and power. Religion and education were central instruments of colonial ideology. Christian missionaries played a complex and often contradictory role in Africa. Some missionaries genuinely opposed extreme abuses and advocated for African welfare. However, missionary activity was deeply intertwined with colonial expansion. Conversion to Christianity often required the rejection of African spiritual systems, which were labeled as pagan, superstitious, or evil. This delegitimized indigenous belief systems and weakened cultural continuity. Mission schools became key sites of ideological transformation. Education emphasized European history, values, and languages while marginalizing African knowledge. Students were taught obedience, discipline, and loyalty to colonial authority. While literacy and education provided some Africans with tools to navigate and later challenge colonial systems, there were also mechanisms of cultural control. Education was not designed to empower Africans fully, but to produce clerks, interpreters, and low-level administrators who would serve the colonial state. Language policy played a crucial role in this process. European languages became the languages of power, law, and opportunity. African languages were often discouraged or banned in formal settings. This linguistic hierarchy reinforced cultural inferiority and created divisions between educated elites and the broader population. Over time, language became both a barrier and a legacy, shaping post-colonial politics and identity. Colonial cultural transformation was never complete or uncontested. Africans adapted, resisted, and reinterpreted imposed ideas in creative ways. New religious movements blended Christian and African beliefs, while educated Africans used colonial languages to critique colonial rule itself. These contradictions reveal that colonial ideology was powerful but not absolute. It reshaped African societies deeply, yet it also produced the intellectual foundations for later resistance and independence. While many African colonies were designed primarily for extraction, some regions experienced a more invasive form of domination known as settler colonialism. In these areas, large numbers of Europeans migrated with the intention of permanent settlement. Colonies such as Algeria, Kenya, southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa became homes for European farmers, administrators, and entrepreneurs who sought land, security, and racial dominance. This fundamentally altered the nature of colonial rule and intensified African dispossession. Settler colonialism depended on land seizure. Fertile land was identified, mapped, and declared European property, often under the justification that it was unused or underdeveloped. African systems of communal land ownership were deliberately ignored or invalidated. Indigenous populations were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and relocated to reserves or marginal areas with poor soil and limited resources. This process destroyed agricultural systems that had sustained communities for generations. European settlers enjoyed extensive legal and political privileges. Colonial administrations prioritized settler interests, often granting them representation, subsidies, and military protection. Africans, meanwhile, were treated as labor pools rather than citizens. Settler economies relied heavily on African labor, yet denied Africans the right to own land, move freely, or compete economically. This created deeply unequal societies where racial hierarchy was enforced through law and violence. Settler colonialism intensified conflict because it threatened African survival directly. Unlike extractive colonialism, which could theoretically withdraw, settler colonialism aimed to replace indigenous presence. Resistance in settler colonies was therefore often fierce and sustained, as Africans fought not only against exploitation, but against erasure. Legal systems were central to land dispossession. Colonial governments introduced land laws that formalized European ownership and criminalized African land use practices. Registration requirements, surveys, and deeds favored settlers who understood European legal systems, while Africans were declared squatters on their own land. These laws transformed theft into legality and resistance into crime. Reserves were presented as protective measures for African populations, but in reality, they were tools of control. Africans were confined to overcrowded and under-resourced areas, often far from markets and water sources. These reserves could not support growing populations, leading to soil exhaustion, hunger, and poverty. Meanwhile, settlers occupied the most productive land, benefiting from state support and infrastructure. Loss of land had devastating social consequences. Land was not merely an economic asset. It was central to identity, spirituality, and community. Dispossession disrupted kinship systems, ancestral connections, and cultural practices. African men were increasingly forced into migrant labor to survive, working on settler farms or in mines while families remained behind. This separation weakened family structures and altered gender roles. Colonial authorities blamed Africans for the resulting poverty, framing it as evidence of inferiority rather than dispossession. This narrative ignored the structural violence embedded in land policy. The legacy of these land laws continues to shape inequality in post-colonial societies, where land redistribution remains a deeply contested and emotional issue. African resistance to settler colonialism was persistent and multifaceted. Early resistance often took the form of armed conflict, as communities attempted to defend their land and autonomy. These uprisings were met with overwhelming force. Settler militias, colonial armies, and police units carried out mass killings, forced removals, and collective punishment to crush opposition. Over time, resistance strategies evolved. Africans formed political organizations, labor unions, and protest movements to challenge settler dominance. Petitions, strikes, and boycotts became tools of resistance, particularly as education spread and urban populations grew. However, colonial authorities responded with repression, banning organizations, imprisoning leaders, and using emergency laws to silence dissent. Settler societies developed particularly harsh racial systems. Segregation laws regulated where Africans could live, work, and travel. Past laws, curfews, and surveillance created environments of constant control. Violence was normalized, and African lives were routinely devalued. These systems laid the groundwork for later institutionalized racism, most notably apartheid in South Africa. Despite repression, resistance in settler colonies never disappeared. The struggle for land and dignity became central to later liberation movements. The intensity of settler colonialism produced equally intense opposition, shaping some of the longest and most difficult paths to independence in Africa. By the early 20th century, Africa had become deeply entangled in European global politics. The scramble for Africa did not end competition between European powers. Instead, it relocated rivalries onto African soil. Colonies were now strategic assets, valued not only for their resources, but also for their military importance. As tensions in Europe escalated, Africa increasingly functioned as both a battlefield and a support system for imperial wars. Colonial armies were created across Africa, composed largely of African soldiers commanded by European officers. These troops were recruited through a mix of coercion, economic pressure, and limited incentives. African soldiers were trained to fight in wars that were not their own, often without understanding the political causes behind them. Loyalty was demanded, not earned. These forces were used to suppress internal resistance and to fight rival colonial powers. Conflicts such as the Fashoda crisis between Britain and France revealed how close imperial rivalry came to war. Although diplomacy prevented direct conflict in that case, it highlighted Africa's role as a testing ground for European power struggles. Borders drawn in Berlin became flashpoints as imperial ambitions collided. African lives and lands were treated as expendable pieces in a larger geopolitical game. This militarization of colonial rule further entrenched violence as a normal feature of governance. The presence of armed forces reinforced fear and submission while draining African communities of manpower. War preparation and competition intensified exploitation, ensuring that Africa remained deeply vulnerable to decisions made far beyond its borders. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked a turning point in Africa's colonial experience. Although the war originated in Europe, it quickly spread to African colonies as rival empires targeted each other's territories. German colonies became immediate objectives for Allied forces. Campaigns were fought in regions such as East Africa, Southwest Africa, and West Africa, turning African landscapes into war zones. African soldiers and porters played a crucial role in the war effort. Millions were recruited or forced into service, carrying supplies, building roads, and fighting in harsh conditions. In East Africa, the war dragged on for years, devastating local populations. Disease, starvation, and displacement claimed far more African lives than combat itself. Yet these sacrifices were largely ignored in post-war narratives. African civilians bore the heaviest burden. Crops were requisitioned, villages destroyed, and food shortages intensified. Colonial authorities prioritized military needs over civilian survival. The war disrupted trade and agriculture, deepening poverty and instability. Africans were asked to sacrifice for empires that denied them rights and dignity. Despite promises of reform and recognition, the end of World War I brought little change for Africans. Instead of independence or self-determination, colonies were redistributed under new arrangements, reinforcing imperial control. The war revealed the hypocrisy of European claims to civilization while exposing the deep contradictions of colonial rule. After World War I, defeated German colonies were redistributed under the League of Nations mandate system. This system claimed to represent a more humane and responsible form of imperial governance. Mandatory powers were supposed to prepare territories for self-rule while improving social and economic conditions. In reality, mandates differed little from traditional colonies. African territories were reclassified, not liberated. Britain, France, Belgium, and South Africa took control of former German colonies, continuing extraction and political exclusion. African voices were still absent from decision-making. The language of trusteeship masked continued domination, allowing imperial powers to present themselves as guardians rather than rulers. The mandate system reinforced African disillusionment. Many Africans had hoped that wartime sacrifice would lead to reform. Instead, they encountered the same labor demands, racial hierarchies, and political repression. These broken promises planted seeds of political awareness and resentment. Educated Africans, veterans, and workers began to question imperial legitimacy more openly. World War I thus reshaped colonial Africa in subtle but profound ways. It exposed European vulnerability, challenged myths of invincibility, and expanded African experience beyond colonial boundaries. Although independence was still decades away, the war marked the beginning of a new political consciousness that would later fuel nationalist movements across the continent. By the early 20th century, colonial rule had unintentionally begun to produce social changes that would later challenge its own authority. One of the most significant developments was the emergence of a small but influential African-educated elite. Mission schools, colonial training institutions, and overseas education created a generation of Africans who were literate, politically aware, and increasingly critical of colonial injustice. Although education had been designed to produce obedient clerks and assistants, it instead became a tool for questioning colonial legitimacy. Urbanization accelerated this transformation. Colonial economies drew Africans into growing towns and cities, where they encountered new ideas, diverse communities, and shared grievances. In urban centers, Africans experienced the contradictions of colonial rule more directly. They saw modern infrastructure built around them, while being excluded from political power and economic opportunity. Segregation, low wages, and racial discrimination were daily realities that sharpened political awareness. Educated Africans began to form associations, newspapers, and discussion groups. These platforms allowed them to articulate grievances, critique colonial policies, and imagine alternative futures. Early political demands were often moderate, focusing on equal treatment, access to education, and limited representation rather than full independence. However, these demands marked a crucial shift. Africans were no longer simply resisting colonial rule through rebellion. They were engaging it intellectually and politically. This emerging elite played a dual role. They often stood between colonial authorities and the wider population, sometimes criticized for being too close to colonial power. Yet they also became essential voices in articulating African aspirations. Their writings and speeches challenged racist assumptions and asserted that Africans were capable of self-government. This intellectual awakening laid the groundwork for later mass movements and nationalist struggles. African political consciousness did not develop in isolation. It was deeply influenced by global movements and connections, particularly Pan-Africanism. This ideology emphasized the shared experiences and destinies of people of African descent worldwide. African intellectuals, alongside members of the African diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean, began to articulate a vision of unity, dignity, and liberation that transcended colonial borders. Pan-African conferences, writings, and networks provided Africans with new political language and frameworks. Thinkers and activists argued that colonialism was not a local problem, but a global system rooted in racism and economic exploitation. By placing African struggles within a broader international context, Pan-Africanism challenged European narratives of superiority and inevitability. These ideas resonated strongly among Africans who had experienced colonial injustice firsthand. Newspapers circulated Pan-African thought, while returning soldiers and overseas students brought new perspectives. The emphasis on self-determination echoed global debates following World War I, even as colonial powers denied Africans those same rights. This contradiction fueled growing anger and determination. Pan-Africanism also highlighted the artificial nature of colonial borders. It reminded Africans that divisions imposed by Europe did not define their identity or future, while unity across the continent remained difficult in practice. The idea itself was powerful. It encouraged Africans to imagine political futures beyond colonial categories, contributing to the ideological foundation of later independence movements. As political awareness grew, colonial authorities responded with suspicion and repression. Early nationalist movements were closely monitored, restricted, or banned outright. Leaders who spoke too boldly were arrested, exiled, or silenced. Colonial governments feared that political organization would threaten stability and economic extraction. As a result, even peaceful advocacy was often treated as subversive. Despite repression, African nationalism continued to develop. Labor movements played a critical role as workers organized strikes and protests against low wages, poor conditions, and racial discrimination. These movements connected economic grievances with political demands, drawing broader sections of society into resistance. Women, often central to market economies and community life, also participated actively, though their contributions were frequently overlooked. Nationalism in this early phase was diverse and uneven. Some movements emphasized cultural revival. Others focused on political rights or economic justice. What united them was a growing rejection of colonial rule as legitimate. Africans increasingly understood colonialism not as a temporary hardship, but as a system fundamentally opposed to their dignity and freedom. Colonial repression could slow, but not stop this transformation. Each act of suppression revealed the limits of imperial tolerance and exposed the hypocrisy of colonial claims to civilization and progress. By the early 20th century, the foundations of African nationalism were firmly in place. The scramble for Africa had created the conditions for its own undoing, as colonial domination gave rise to the ideas and movements that would ultimately challenge it. Colonial rule fundamentally reshaped African economies, but not in ways that encouraged balanced or independent development. European powers deliberately designed colonial economies to serve imperial needs. Africa was integrated into the global capitalist system as a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of manufactured goods from Europe. This economic structure ensured that wealth flowed outward, reinforcing dependency rather than sustainability. Colonial planners discouraged industrialization in Africa. Manufacturing that could compete with European industries was actively blocked through tariffs, regulations, and lack of investment. Instead, colonies were encouraged to specialize in a narrow range of exports, such as cocoa, coffee, cotton, rubber, and minerals. This specialization made colonial economies extremely vulnerable to price fluctuations in global markets, leaving African producers exposed to crises they could not control. Trade policies favored European companies, which dominated shipping, finance, and export industries. African producers received minimal profits, while European firms captured the majority of value. Colonial currencies and banking systems were structured to serve metropolitan economies, limiting African access to credit and investment. Even when Africans succeeded economically, they faced racial barriers that restricted expansion. This economic design was not accidental or temporary. It was a deliberate strategy to prevent colonies from becoming self-sufficient. By locking African territories into unequal economic relationships, colonial powers ensured long-term dependence. These structural patterns would persist long after independence, shaping post-colonial economic challenges and limiting development options. Colonial authorities frequently pointed to infrastructure development as evidence of progress. Roads, railways, and ports were indeed constructed across Africa, but their purpose was narrowly defined. Infrastructure was built to extract resources efficiently, not to connect African communities or promote internal development. Railways typically ran from mines or plantations directly to ports, bypassing local needs. This extractive infrastructure fragmented African economies. Regions rich in resources were developed in isolation, while others were neglected entirely. Internal trade between African communities remained underdeveloped, reinforcing dependence on external markets. Infrastructure served colonial logistics rather than African mobility or integration. Urban centers that emerged around ports and administrative hubs reflected this imbalance. Cities became centers of colonial administration and commerce, while rural areas bore the burden of production without equivalent investment. Services such as electricity, sanitation, and healthcare were concentrated in European neighborhoods, leaving African areas underdeveloped and overcrowded. After independence, many African states inherited infrastructure systems that were poorly suited to national development. Railways did not connect regions, roads bypassed population centers, and economies lacked internal cohesion. The colonial approach to infrastructure left behind physical systems that reinforced economic fragmentation rather than unity. The economic legacy of colonialism did not end with political independence. Newly independent African states inherited economies shaped by decades of extraction, dependence, and underinvestment. Governments faced the challenge of transforming systems designed for exploitation into engines of national development. This task was made more difficult by limited resources, external debt, and continued dependence on former colonial powers. Export dependency remained a major issue. Many African countries continued to rely on a small number of commodities, leaving them vulnerable to global price shocks. Efforts to diversify economies were often constrained by lack of capital, infrastructure limitations, and international trade structures that favored industrialized nations. Economic sovereignty proved difficult to achieve in a world still shaped by colonial-era inequalities. Colonial education systems had also failed to prepare Africans for economic management at a national scale. Technical skills, industrial planning, and financial expertise were scarce, reflecting deliberate colonial neglect. This gap was often used to justify continued external intervention, reinforcing neo-colonial relationships. Understanding colonial economic structures is essential to understanding modern African challenges. Poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment are not the result of failure or incapacity, but of systems designed to extract rather than empower. The scramble for Africa created economic patterns that continue to shape global inequality today. Colonial rule in Africa relied heavily on legal systems designed not to ensure justice, but to institutionalize control. European powers introduced legal frameworks that prioritized order and obedience over fairness or equality. These systems created a sharp divide between colonizers and the colonized, embedding racial hierarchy directly into the law. Africans were governed by special regulations, customary courts controlled by colonial officials, or emergency laws that gave administrators sweeping powers. Colonial law criminalized everyday African behavior. Practices such as land use, movement, taxation resistance, and cultural rituals were often redefined as illegal. Vagrancy laws, past systems, and labor regulations restricted African freedom of movement and economic independence. These laws allowed colonial authorities to arrest, fine, or imprison Africans with minimal justification. Legal ambiguity was intentional, granting colonial officials wide discretion to punish resistance. Courts rarely treated Africans as equal subjects. Testimony from Africans was often discounted, while European officials enjoyed near-total legal immunity. Corporal punishment, including flogging, was legally sanctioned and widely practiced. The law thus became a daily reminder of subordination. Justice was not blind, it was racialized. By embedding repression into legal systems, colonial regimes normalized violence. Coercion no longer appeared as arbitrary cruelty, but as lawful governance. This transformation of violence into legality was one of colonialism's most enduring legacies, shaping attitudes toward authority and justice long after independence. Colonial states depended on extensive systems of policing and surveillance to maintain control over vast territories. Police forces were often understaffed, yet heavily armed, operating with little accountability. Their primary role was not crime prevention, but enforcement of colonial order. Tax collection, labor recruitment, and suppression of dissent were central duties. Surveillance extended into everyday life. Informants were recruited within communities, fostering suspicion and fear. Political meetings were monitored, correspondence intercepted, and leaders watched closely. Colonial authorities viewed any form of organization among Africans as a potential threat. Even cultural gatherings could be interpreted as subversive. Violence was used preemptively. Collective punishment was common, with entire villages penalized for the actions of individuals. Homes were burned, livestock seized, and communities displaced. These measures were intended to deter resistance through fear rather than address grievances. The psychological impact was profound, creating an environment where obedience became a survival strategy. This culture of fear shaped African responses to colonial rule. Open resistance became risky, leading many to adopt subtle forms of defiance. At the same time, repression radicalized political movements as peaceful avenues for change were closed. Policing thus both maintained colonial order and sowed the seeds of its eventual challenge. Colonial governments frequently governed through states of emergency. Whenever resistance emerged, authorities suspended normal legal protections and expanded their powers. Emergency regulations allowed detention without trial, censorship, forced relocation, and military intervention. What began as temporary measures often became permanent features of governance. These emergency powers revealed the insecurity at the heart of colonial rule. Despite claims of stability and legitimacy, colonial regimes relied on extraordinary measures to survive. Resistance was treated not as a political disagreement, but as a security threat. This framing justified extreme violence and silenced dissenting voices. Emergency governance also blurred the line between civilian and military authority. Soldiers and police assumed administrative roles, while administrators directed military operations. Violence became bureaucratized, managed through reports, quotas, and regulations. Suffering was reduced to statistics. The legacy of emergency rule extended beyond colonialism. Many post-colonial states inherited legal frameworks that normalized authoritarian practices. Understanding this history helps explain why struggles over law, security, and human rights remain central to African politics today. Colonial rule did not merely occupy territory, it reshaped governance itself. Colonialism in Africa did not only seize land and labor, it also targeted meaning, belief, and identity. European powers imposed their own cultural frameworks, dismissing African worldviews as primitive, irrational, or inferior. This cultural assault was deliberate. By undermining African belief systems, colonial authorities weakened social cohesion and justified foreign rule. Culture became a battlefield where domination was reinforced daily. African religions, philosophies, and moral systems were systematically devalued. Colonial officials and missionaries often portrayed African spiritual practices as superstition or witchcraft. Sacred sites were destroyed, rituals banned, and traditional healers criminalized. These actions disrupted systems that had long governed health, ethics, and community life. What Europeans labeled as progress often meant cultural loss and disorientation for African societies. Art, music, and oral traditions were also affected. Colonial education privileged written European languages over oral African knowledge. Stories, histories, and genealogies that had been preserved through generations of storytelling were sidelined or forgotten. Museums in Europe collected African artifacts without context, removing cultural objects from their communities and redefining them as curiosities rather than living heritage. Yet culture did not disappear. Africans adapted, preserved, and transformed traditions under pressure. New cultural forms emerged, blending African and European elements. These adaptations were acts of survival and resistance. Cultural continuity, even in altered form, became a quiet but powerful challenge to colonial domination, preserving identity in the face of systematic erasure. Colonial rule profoundly altered gender relations in African societies. While pre-colonial gender systems varied widely, many recognized complementary roles and shared authority between men and women. Colonialism disrupted these systems by imposing European patriarchal norms that marginalized women politically and economically. This transformation reshaped African societies in lasting ways. Colonial administrations typically recognized only male leaders as legitimate authorities, ignoring or dismantling female leadership structures. Women who had held political, economic, or spiritual power found themselves excluded from decision-making. Colonial legal systems often denied women land rights, tying ownership to male heads of household. This eroded women's economic independence and social status. Economic policies further disadvantaged women. Cash crop agriculture and wage labor targeted men, while women were left to maintain households and subsistence, farming under increasingly difficult conditions. As men migrated for work, women bore greater responsibility without corresponding authority or resources. Colonial narratives portrayed African women as passive and oppressed, ignoring their resilience and agency. Despite these challenges, African women resisted and adapted. They organized market protests, supported nationalist movements, and preserved cultural practices. Women played crucial roles in strikes, boycotts, and community resistance, though colonial and later historical records often minimize their contributions. Gendered experiences of colonialism reveal its deep social impact and highlight the importance of inclusive historical understanding. Colonialism also reshaped Africa's physical environment. European powers introduced new agricultural practices, mining operations, and settlement patterns that altered landscapes dramatically. These changes were driven by profit, not sustainability. Colonial authorities often ignored indigenous environmental knowledge, which had evolved to manage local ecosystems responsibly. Large-scale plantations replaced diverse farming systems, reducing biodiversity and exhausting soil. Cash crop monoculture increased vulnerability to pests, disease, and climate variation. Mining operations polluted water sources and displaced communities. Wildlife conservation policies, often framed as environmental protection, restricted African access to land and resources while catering to European interests such as hunting and tourism. Colonial environmental policies criminalized traditional practices like shifting cultivation and communal grazing. Africans were blamed for environmental degradation caused largely by colonial extraction. These narratives justified further control and displacement, reinforcing cycles of dispossession. The environmental legacy of colonialism persists today. Land degradation, resource conflicts, and unequal access to natural wealth are rooted in colonial-era decisions. Understanding these impacts is essential for addressing contemporary challenges related to sustainability, land rights, and environmental justice. Colonialism reshaped not only societies, but the land itself, leaving scars that remain visible. Colonial education systems in Africa were never designed to empower African populations fully. Instead, they were structured to produce a small, controlled class of Africans who could assist in administering the colonial system. Education was viewed as a tool of governance, not liberation. European authorities feared that widespread or advanced education would encourage political awareness and resistance, so access was limited and tightly regulated. Missionaries played a central role in education, often operating schools with colonial support. Curriculum emphasized basic literacy, religious instruction, and vocational skills suited for low-level employment. Subjects such as critical history, political theory, and advanced science were largely absent. Africans were taught to obey authority, respect European values, and accept their subordinate status. Education thus reinforced colonial ideology rather than challenging it. Opportunities for higher education were extremely rare. Most Africans were barred from universities or professional training. Those who did receive advanced education often had to travel abroad, where they encountered new ideas about freedom, equality, and self-determination. Ironically, these individuals would later become some of colonialism's most vocal critics. The limited nature of colonial education created deep inequalities within African societies. A small educated elite gained access to jobs and influence, while the majority remained excluded. This division had lasting consequences, shaping post-colonial politics and social structures. Colonial education did not fail accidentally. It succeeded in producing dependence, hierarchy, and control. Language was one of the most powerful tools of colonial domination. European languages were imposed as the languages of administration, education, and law. Mastery of these languages became a prerequisite for social mobility and political participation. African languages, despite their richness and complexity, were often dismissed as inadequate or primitive. This linguistic hierarchy had profound consequences. Africans educated in colonial languages often became separated from their communities, while those who retained indigenous languages were excluded from power. Language became a gatekeeper, determining who could speak, who could be heard, and whose knowledge mattered. Colonial governments justified this system by claiming that European languages promoted unity and efficiency, ignoring the cultural violence it inflicted. Language policy also shaped how history and reality were described. African experiences were filtered through foreign vocabulary and concepts, distorting meaning. Colonial reports framed resistance as disorder, exploitation as development, and violence as discipline. By controlling language, colonial authorities controlled narratives. After independence, language remained a complex legacy. European languages continued to dominate education and governance, often serving as neutral bridges between diverse ethnic groups. At the same time, they preserved colonial hierarchies. Debates over language reflect deeper struggles over identity, power, and decolonization of knowledge. Colonialism profoundly influenced how knowledge about Africa was produced and circulated. European scholars, administrators, and travelers documented African societies through colonial lenses, often emphasizing difference, deficiency, and exoticism. African voices were marginalized or excluded entirely. Knowledge became a means of domination, shaping global perceptions of Africa. Colonial archives recorded what administrators considered important: taxes, labor, resistance, and resources. Everyday African experiences, perspectives, and interpretations were largely absent. Oral traditions were ignored or dismissed as unreliable, despite being sophisticated systems of historical memory. This imbalance created a distorted historical record that privileged colonial viewpoints. Education systems reinforced this erasure. African students learned European history in detail, while their own histories were minimized or omitted. This produced generations who were disconnected from their past. The psychological impact was significant, undermining confidence and cultural pride. Recovering African history has required deliberate effort by scholars, communities, and activists. Oral histories, archaeology, and indigenous knowledge systems have challenged colonial narratives. This process of historical recovery is not merely academic, it is political. Reclaiming knowledge is central to reclaiming dignity and agency. The struggle over history reflects the enduring legacy of the scramble for Africa and the ongoing effort to decolonize understanding itself. Colonial medicine in Africa was often presented as one of the most benevolent aspects of European rule. Hospitals, clinics, and vaccination campaigns were showcased as proof that colonialism improved African lives. However, the primary purpose of colonial medical systems was not humanitarian care, but the protection of colonial interests. European authorities focused on maintaining a healthy labor force and safeguarding European settlers, administrators, and soldiers from disease. Medical resources were distributed unequally. European populations had access to modern hospitals, trained doctors, and sanitation systems, while African communities were served by understaffed clinics or mobile units with limited supplies. Preventive care for Africans was often neglected unless it directly affected productivity or posed a risk to Europeans. Health policy was shaped by racial priorities rather than universal concern. Colonial medicine also functioned as a tool of surveillance and control. Medical inspections were used to regulate movement, particularly among laborers. Quarantines, pass systems, and forced examinations restricted African mobility. In some cases, entire communities were relocated under the justification of disease prevention. These measures were imposed without consent and often caused trauma and disruption. Traditional African healing practices were frequently dismissed or criminalized. Colonial authorities labeled indigenous medicine as superstition, despite its deep knowledge of local environments and health practices. This dismissal undermined community trust and removed accessible forms of care. Colonial medicine thus operated within a framework of dominance, reinforcing racial hierarchies while presenting itself as progress. Colonial economic systems contributed directly to widespread illness and mortality. Forced labor, overcrowded living conditions, poor nutrition, and environmental disruption created ideal conditions for disease. Workers on plantations, in mines, and on construction projects were exposed to harsh climates, dangerous tools, and inadequate medical support. Exhaustion and injury were common, and death was often treated as an acceptable cost. Urbanization under colonial rule intensified health crises. African neighborhoods were overcrowded and lacked clean water, sanitation, and waste disposal. Epidemics such as cholera, tuberculosis, and influenza spread rapidly. Colonial authorities often blamed Africans for these conditions, ignoring the structural causes rooted in segregation and neglect. Health crises were framed as moral or cultural failures rather than policy outcomes. Nutrition declined as colonial economies prioritized cash crops over food production. Famine and malnutrition became more frequent, weakening immune systems and increasing vulnerability to disease. These outcomes were not accidental. They reflected an economic model that valued export profits over human survival. The unequal burden of disease revealed the true priorities of colonial rule. Health interventions expanded only when epidemics threatened European populations or economic productivity. African suffering, when it did not affect colonial interests, was largely ignored. This pattern deepened mistrust of colonial authorities and highlighted the human cost of economic exploitation. One of the darkest aspects of colonial medicine was the use of African populations for medical experimentation. Africans were often subjected to treatments, trials, and procedures without informed consent. Colonial authorities justified these practices by portraying Africans as suitable subjects for experimentation, reflecting deeply racist assumptions about African bodies and rights. Vaccination campaigns, drug trials, and surgical procedures were sometimes conducted with little regard for safety or ethics. Failures were rarely documented, and victims had no legal recourse. These experiments contributed to medical knowledge that benefited Europe while exposing Africans to risk and harm. The imbalance of power made refusal nearly impossible. Medical experimentation reinforced fear and resistance. Communities sometimes avoided clinics or vaccination teams, associating them with coercion and danger. Colonial authorities interpreted this reluctance as ignorance, further justifying force. This cycle undermined trust in public health initiatives and complicated future healthcare efforts. The legacy of colonial medical abuse continues to influence perceptions of healthcare in many African societies. Distrust of medical institutions and external interventions can be traced to these historical experiences. Recognizing this history is essential for building ethical and inclusive healthcare systems today. Colonial medicine was not simply a story of progress. It was deeply entangled with exploitation, violence, and inequality. World War II marked another decisive moment in the relationship between Africa and European imperial powers. Once again, African colonies were drawn into a global conflict that originated far beyond their borders. Colonial governments mobilized African resources, labor, and soldiers on a massive scale. Millions of Africans were conscripted or recruited to serve in armies, work in war industries, and supply food and raw materials essential to the war effort. Africa became strategically vital, not only as a source of manpower, but also as a geographic and economic asset. African soldiers fought in North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Europe itself. They endured harsh conditions, discrimination, and unequal treatment compared to European troops. Pay was lower, promotions were limited, and living conditions were inferior. Yet African soldiers gained new experiences and perspectives. They traveled widely, encountered different cultures, and witnessed European vulnerability firsthand. The myth of European invincibility was severely weakened. At home, civilian populations faced increased hardship. Colonial governments intensified taxation, requisitioned crops, and expanded forced labor to support wartime needs. Food shortages and inflation hit African communities hard. Despite promises that sacrifice would be rewarded after the war, colonial policies remained exploitative. Africans were expected to give everything while receiving little in return. The war exposed deep contradictions in colonial ideology. European powers claimed to be fighting for freedom, democracy, and human rights against fascism, yet denied those same principles to their colonies. This hypocrisy did not go unnoticed. World War II accelerated African political awareness and sharpened demands for change. The aftermath of World War II transformed African politics. Returning veterans were among the most politically significant groups. Having fought for empires that denied them equality, many veterans felt betrayed and disillusioned. They had handled modern weapons, organized collectively, and seen European societies firsthand. These experiences undermined colonial narratives of African inferiority and inspired demands for recognition, rights, and independence. Urban workers also became increasingly active. Wartime industrial expansion had drawn Africans into factories, docks, and transport systems. Workers organized strikes to protest low wages, poor conditions, and racial discrimination. These strikes were often met with violence, but they demonstrated the growing power of collective action. Labor movements became crucial foundations for nationalist politics. Political organizations expanded rapidly in this period. Unlike earlier elite-led movements, post-war nationalism increasingly involved mass participation. Farmers, workers, women, and youth joined protests, rallies, and political parties. Nationalism became a broad social force rather than a limited intellectual movement. Demands shifted from reform to full independence. Colonial authorities struggled to respond. Repression often intensified, but it proved less effective against mass movements. The scale of political mobilization made it difficult to maintain control. World War II, thus, transformed African nationalism from a developing idea into an unstoppable force. World War II also reshaped the international system in ways that undermined colonial rule. European powers emerged from the war economically weakened and politically vulnerable. Maintaining overseas empires became increasingly expensive and difficult. At the same time, new global institutions and ideologies challenged the legitimacy of imperial domination. The creation of the United Nations introduced new language around self-determination and human rights. Although these principles were applied unevenly, they provided African leaders with powerful tools to challenge colonial authority on the global stage. Anti-colonial movements gained international attention and support, particularly as the Cold War intensified and newly powerful states sought influence in Africa. Colonial violence became harder to hide. Media coverage, international advocacy, and diplomatic pressure exposed abuses and undermined imperial moral authority. European claims to civilization rang increasingly hollow. Colonies were no longer seen as symbols of prestige, but as sources of instability and criticism. By the late 1940s, the foundations of empire were deeply shaken. While colonial powers attempted reforms and gradual transitions, the momentum toward independence was irreversible. World War II did not immediately end colonialism, but it made its continuation unsustainable. The scramble for Africa had entered its final phase as empires began to unravel under the weight of their own contradictions. By the late 1940s and 1950s, European colonial authority in Africa was rapidly losing its grip. Decolonization was not a sudden or peaceful process. It was the result of prolonged resistance, political struggle, and shifting global power structures. Colonial administrations found it increasingly difficult to justify and maintain control over African territories. The legitimacy that imperial powers once claimed was now widely challenged both within Africa and internationally. African nationalist movements had matured into organized political forces capable of mobilizing mass support. Leaders articulated clear demands for self-rule, independence, and dignity. Political parties expanded across urban and rural areas, using rallies, newspapers, and unions to spread nationalist ideas. Colonial governments responded with a mixture of repression and reform, attempting to slow the process while preserving influence. Violence played a central role in many decolonization struggles. In some regions, colonial authorities refused to negotiate, leading to armed conflict. Brutal counterinsurgency campaigns were launched to suppress nationalist movements. Villages were destroyed, civilians detained, and torture used to extract information. These actions revealed the lengths to which colonial powers were willing to go to protect their interests. Despite repression, the momentum toward independence was unstoppable. Colonial rule had become too costly politically, economically, and morally. The authority imposed during the scramble for Africa was unraveling, exposing the fragility of empires built on force rather than consent. African countries followed different paths to independence depending on colonial policy, settler presence, and local resistance. In some cases, independence was achieved through negotiation. Britain, in particular, pursued gradual constitutional transitions in several colonies, granting limited self-government before full independence. These processes often favored elite leaders and preserved colonial institutions. In other regions, independence came only after prolonged and violent struggle. Settler colonies were especially resistant to change, as European populations feared losing land and privilege. Liberation wars erupted in places like Algeria, Kenya, and parts of southern Africa. These conflicts were marked by extreme violence on both sides, leaving deep scars on societies and political systems. Negotiated independence often masked unresolved tensions. Colonial borders economic dependence, and administrative systems remained largely intact. While flags changed and national anthems were written, structural inequalities persisted. Independence was a beginning, not an end. African leaders faced immense challenges. They inherited states designed for control rather than service, economies dependent on exports, and societies fragmented by colonial policies. Despite these obstacles, independence represented a powerful assertion of African agency. It marked the formal end of the scramble for Africa as a political system. Independence was greeted with immense optimism across Africa. For many, it symbolized the recovery of dignity stolen during colonial rule. Celebrations filled streets and villages as new nations emerged. Leaders spoke of unity, development, and a future free from exploitation. The emotional significance of independence cannot be overstated. It represented generations of struggle and sacrifice. However, independence also brought uncertainty. New governments faced pressure to deliver economic growth, political stability, and social justice with limited resources. Expectations were high, but the legacy of colonialism constrained possibilities. Colonial economies had not prepared African states for self-sufficiency, and global inequalities remained entrenched. Cold War politics further complicated the situation. Newly independent states were drawn into global rivalries, often pressured to align with competing powers. Foreign influence continued, sometimes reinforcing dependence rather than autonomy. The dream of full liberation proved difficult to realize. Decolonization marked the end of direct European rule, but not the end of colonial influence. The scramble for Africa left behind structures that shaped post-colonial realities. Independence was a profound achievement, yet it also revealed the depth of colonialism's legacy and a long road toward genuine sovereignty. Although African nations achieved political independence in the mid-20th century, true sovereignty proved far more elusive. Many newly independent states quickly discovered that while colonial flags have been lowered, colonial economic structures remained firmly in place. This condition came to be described as neocolonialism, a system in which former colonial powers and new global actors continue to exert control through economic, political, and cultural means rather than direct rule. Colonial economies had been designed for extraction, not self-sufficiency. After independence, African states still depended heavily on exporting raw materials to global markets dominated by former colonial powers. Prices were volatile, terms of trade were unequal, and industrial capacity was limited. Attempts to diversify economies often required foreign investment, which came with conditions that restricted policy choices and reinforced dependence. Foreign aid and loans became new instruments of influence. International financial institutions and donor states offered assistance, but often demanded structural reforms that prioritized repayment and market liberalization over social development. These policies limited state control over resources and weakened public services. While presented as modernization, they frequently deepened inequality and vulnerability. Neocolonialism demonstrated that the scramble for Africa did not simply end with independence. Control had shifted form rather than disappeared. Political freedom without economic autonomy left African states constrained, struggling to fulfill the promises of independence under global systems shaped by colonial history. Neo-colonial influence extended beyond economics into African politics. During the Cold War, African nations became sites of intense global competition. External powers sought allies, access to resources, and strategic advantage. This often involved direct or indirect intervention in domestic politics, undermining democratic processes and sovereignty. Coups and regime changes were frequently supported or tolerated when leaders threatened foreign interests. Governments that attempted to nationalize resources or pursue independent economic paths faced destabilization, sanctions, or isolation. In contrast, authoritarian regimes that aligned with external powers often received military aid and diplomatic support. This pattern weakened political accountability and entrenched instability. Military assistance programs trained African armed forces in ways that sometimes empowered them over civilian institutions. This contributed to cycles of military rule and repression in several countries. Political development was shaped not only by internal dynamics, but by external pressures that prioritized stability and access over democracy. These interventions echoed colonial patterns of control. African agency was constrained by global power structures that continued to treat the continent as a strategic space rather than a collection of sovereign nations. Neo-colonial politics reinforced the idea that Africa's future was still subject to decisions made elsewhere. Neo-colonialism also operated at the level of culture and knowledge. Colonial languages remained dominant in governance, education, and international relations. While these languages facilitated communication across diverse societies, they also preserve hierarchies rooted in colonial rule. Indigenous languages and knowledge systems continued to be marginalized. Media, education, and popular culture were heavily influenced by external models. African success was often measured against Western standards, reinforcing perceptions of inferiority and dependence. Development narratives portrayed Africa as perpetually behind, requiring guidance rather than partnership. These narratives shape policy, aid, and global perception. At the same time, African societies actively challenge cultural dependence. Writers, artists, musicians, and intellectuals reclaimed African identities and histories. Cultural movements emphasized pride, resistance, and self-definition. These efforts revealed that neo-colonial influence, while powerful, was not uncontested. The persistence of colonial mindsets shows that the scramble for Africa was not only a political and economic event, but a psychological one. Undoing its effects requires more than independence. It demands a reimagining of value, knowledge, and power. Neo-colonialism remains one of the most complex and enduring legacies of colonial rule. One of the most enduring and destabilizing legacies of the scramble for Africa is the system of borders imposed by European powers. These borders, drawn hastily in European capitals with little knowledge of local realities, ignored ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and political landscapes. As a result, African states emerged from independence with boundaries that often made governance difficult and conflict more likely. The problem was not African diversity, but the way colonialism fragmented and forced together societies without consent. Many borders divided communities that had shared history, kinship, and economic networks for centuries. Families, clans, and ethnic groups found themselves split across different states, subject to different laws and administrations. At the same time, rival or historically independent groups were compressed into single political units, expected to function as unified nations overnight. Colonial authorities had managed these divisions through coercion. Post-colonial states inherited the challenge without the same means or legitimacy. After independence, African leaders faced a difficult choice: redraw borders or preserve them. Redrawing risked endless territorial disputes and war, while preservation meant accepting colonial legacies. Most states chose stability over revision, affirming colonial borders through international agreements. While this decision avoided immediate chaos, it left underlying tensions unresolved. Conflicts in regions such as the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes, and parts of West and Central Africa cannot be understood without reference to these borders. Resource competition, identity politics, and political exclusion often intersect along colonial fault lines. The scramble for Africa thus continues to shape the continent's political geography long after empires have disappeared. Colonial rule did not create ethnic diversity in Africa, but it transformed how ethnicity functioned politically. European administrations categorized, ranked, and politicized identities as part of divide and rule strategies. Groups were labeled, fixed, and sometimes privileged over others to maintain control. These classifications hardened identities that had previously been more flexible and contextual. Colonial authorities often favored certain groups for education, employment, or administrative roles, creating new hierarchies. These decisions were driven by convenience, stereotypes, or local alliances rather than fairness. Over time, colonial favoritism produced resentment and competition. Access to power and resources became associated with identity, embedding inequality into social structures. After independence, these dynamics did not disappear. New governments inherited states where access to land, jobs, and political influence was unevenly distributed. Leaders sometimes mobilized ethnic identities to consolidate power or marginalize opponents. While these practices were shaped by post-colonial politics, their roots lay in colonial manipulation. It is important to reject simplistic explanations that blame conflict on ancient tribal hatreds. Such narratives ignore the historical processes that politicized identity. Ethnicity became a tool of power under colonialism, not an inherent source of violence. Understanding this history is essential for addressing conflict in ways that promote justice rather than division. Despite the heavy legacy of colonial borders and divisions, African societies have demonstrated remarkable resilience. Communities have found ways to coexist, cooperate, and rebuild in the face of structural challenges. Regional organizations, peace processes, and constitutional reforms represent ongoing efforts to manage diversity and reduce conflict. Many African states have pursued decentralization, power sharing, and inclusive governance to address historical grievances. Truth and reconciliation processes, land reform initiatives, and cross-border cooperation aim to heal colonial wounds. These efforts are complex and imperfect, but they reflect active engagement with history rather than passive inheritance. Civil society organizations, youth movements, and women's groups play vital roles in promoting dialogue and accountability. They challenge exclusionary politics and demand systems that reflect lived realities rather than colonial frameworks. Cultural revival and historical education also contribute to reconciliation by restoring shared memory and dignity. The long shadow of the scramble for Africa remains visible, but it does not define Africa's future. History shapes conditions, not destiny. By confronting colonial legacies honestly and creatively, African societies continue to assert agency and imagine more inclusive political futures. The Scramble for Africa is often presented as a historical episode confined to the years between 1884 and 1914, marked by the Berlin Conference and rapid European conquest. However, understanding it only as a short period of territorial division dramatically underestimates its significance. The Scramble was not merely an event. It was a transformative process that reshaped global power, African societies, and international systems in ways that continue to influence the present. At its core, the scramble represented a fundamental denial of African humanity and sovereignty. European powers treated Africa as an object rather than a continent of people, histories, and futures. Decisions were made without African consent, justified through racial ideology, and enforced through violence. This process normalized the idea that power, not justice, determined legitimacy in global affairs. The scramble also reveals how modern international systems were built on inequality. Concepts such as borders, sovereignty, trade, and development were applied selectively. European states respected one another's claims while ignoring African rights entirely. This double standard shaped global governance and continues to influence international relations today. Reframing the scramble as a structural injustice rather than a historical curiosity allows for deeper understanding. It forces recognition that many contemporary challenges, economic inequality, political instability, and global imbalance, are not accidents, but outcomes of deliberate historical processes. Remembering the scramble is therefore not about the past alone. It is about understanding the roots of the present. How the scramble for Africa is remembered matters deeply. For decades, colonial narratives minimized violence and emphasized supposed benefits, such as infrastructure or administration. These narratives obscured suffering and shifted attention away from African experiences. Challenging this memory is an essential step toward historical justice. African scholars, artists, and communities have played a central role in reclaiming history. Oral traditions, local archives, and cultural expression have restored perspectives erased from colonial records. This recovery challenges the idea that Africa lacks history and asserts African voices as central to understanding global history. There is also growing international debate about responsibility and accountability. Discussions around reparations, restitution of stolen cultural artifacts, and acknowledgement of colonial crimes reflect a changing global consciousness. While these debates are complex and contested, they signal recognition that colonialism was not a neutral process, but a moral and material injustice. Historical justice is not about assigning guilt to individuals today, but about acknowledging harm and its consequences. It requires honest education, ethical remembrance, and structural change. Addressing the legacy of the scramble means confronting uncomfortable truths and resisting narratives that excuse or sanitize domination. Despite the immense damage caused by the scramble for Africa, the continent's history is not defined solely by victimhood. African societies have demonstrated extraordinary resilience, creativity, and agency. From anti-colonial resistance to post-independence reform, Africans have continuously shaped their own futures under difficult conditions. Today, Africa is a continent of innovation, cultural influence, and political experimentation. Young populations, technological growth, and regional cooperation present new possibilities. At the same time, colonial legacies continue to constrain development, reminding us that history does not disappear simply because time passes. Moving beyond the scramble requires more than economic growth or political reform. It requires a transformation of global relationships. Fair trade, respectful diplomacy, cultural equality, and shared responsibility are essential for breaking patterns established during colonialism. Africa's future should not be shaped by extraction or pity, but by partnership and respect. The scramble for Africa was one of the most consequential events in world history. Its legacy is painful, but its lessons are powerful. By understanding how the continent was divided, exploited, and resisted domination, we gain insight into how a more just global order might be built. The story does not end with the scramble. It continues in the ongoing struggle for dignity, equity, and self-determination. You heard how a continent was divided without consent, how borders were drawn without understanding, how economies were built to extract, not to develop, how culture, land, labor, and dignity were taken in the name of empire. But you also heard something more important. You heard about resistance. You heard about resilience. You heard how Africans did not disappear, did not surrender their identity, and did not stop fighting for dignity, even when the world refused to listen. The moral of this history is simple, but powerful. Colonialism was not an accident. Underdevelopment was not natural. And history does not end when empires fall. The problems of today, inequality, conflict, dependency, did not appear overnight. They were built step by step during moments like the Scramble for Africa. And understanding this truth is the first step toward justice, respect, and change. At Historyteller YT, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the roots of the world we live in. If this history made you think, if it changed how you see the past, then stay with us, because many more untold histories are waiting. And the next story might explain the world even more clearly. This is Historyteller YT. Until the next chapter of history,